Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to our video today. Huong Tu is a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, known as ASPI. She focuses on Asian regional security, ASEAN, defense diplomacy, Vietnam, and China-Southeast Asia relations. Huong recently published an article with the Council on Foreign Relations blog, Asia Unbound, in which she discusses Vietnam's successful battle with COVID-19 so far. Thank you for joining us today, Huong. My first question for you is broad. Can you tell us a bit about the article and just some of your key points?
Yes, so I wrote it around the time that Vietnam lifted the social distancing restrictions, which it did on 23rd of April, as the first in Southeast Asia and actually one of the first in the world to really ease those restrictions and gradually coming back to new normal life, normal as it can be. After a quite successful, I intentionally avoid the word successful, but a quite effective response because we don't really know how many waves there are still ahead of us. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but I think it's good to give a due credit to the response that Vietnam has given to the pandemic. Many would attribute, effective social distancing control and tracing to the authoritarian regime and the control over citizens. But I also wanted to remind that Vietnam was the first one in 2003 that had contained the SARS outbreak, and it was announced by the WHO back then. And Vietnam, like, for example, Taiwan, which is full democracy, has been quite successful in applying very similar, although different, with different proportions, measures, which is early response, rigorous testing, very, very diligent contact tracing, and also kind of civic cooperation, which is very, very crucial to effective government response. It was something that a cooperation between people and government that combination has resulted in so far containing the virus. So at the moment, we have only 280 some cases noted as of today, less than 300, 0 deaths, and I think less than 50 active cases. So the remaining have recovered from the virus. But as we say, it's a lot ahead of us, but it's important to understand what has worked so far and what kind of tools, given how Vietnam is a very, very densely populated. It's almost 100 million population, very densely populated cities. It's close to China and has border with China's frequent travels, frequent tourism visits, economic ties, and still and limited comparing to different countries in the world, limited budget to the healthcare, and still quite successful so far.
Yes, that's very interesting. You mentioned Vietnam's past experience with the SARS outbreak back in 2003. Can you tell me a little bit more? You mentioned some of them, a little bit more about the tools that the Vietnamese government has used to help them control the outbreak.
Yes, so Vietnam was one of the very first countries that noted cases of novel coronavirus outside of China, outside of Wuhan, so as early as late January. And very early, the government took it very seriously. It's something that, everybody was on alert, both in the government as well as in the society. I think there was a massive campaign of informing the big population that was heading towards Tet, which is the biggest celebration of the year, the Lunar New Year. So everybody was traveling, everybody was visiting friends and relatives. Luckily, it was school holidays, which means that the government made a quick decision of not returning to schools after the Tet holiday breaks. So that helped. But very early on during the festive season, the Prime Minister said to the public that it is the virus is like your enemy. So we have to unite to fight the enemy. So I think that was a critical part. In any emergency response, the golden opportunity is very early, and if you miss it, it's really dangerous. So it was contained when the spread was still very limited, and it was very rigorous to trace any cases or potential cases or the people who had come in contact with the confirmed cases. So the testing was not widespread or random, like in, for example, South Korea, which has much higher budget than Vietnam, but it was very meticulously traced. Another key issue was also success with developing test kits. Vietnam was one of the very early ones to not only successfully develop those test kits, but also exporting them. And from January, where Vietnam had only a couple of test labs that are laboratories that were able to conduct those tests, by April it was over 100 those labs that are able to conduct tests. So that's quite an important factor as well. And Vietnam also very early on made a decision to close borders with China, close direct flights, and also obviously that limited the tourist intake, and also wasn't very well received in China, but it was critical to contain the spread. Vietnam had, I think, a second wave when there were more cases coming in from Europe, but also later by late March, all the flights were either stopped or seriously limited. So I think the key was very early response, very serious approach to that. It wasn't communicated as something that only affect vulnerable group, but it would affect everyone. So it was everybody's responsibility to take care of themselves as well as their surrounding by understanding the hygienes and social distancing. I think Vietnamese government was quite innovative in communicating those from, as we know, from viral songs and videos and as well as posters, how to wash your hands and keep distance from others. So I think strategic communication was also a very important part.
Yeah, I was in Hanoi in late February, as you know, and it struck me how quickly the government had sent students home from school. Everyone was teasing me. They said, "Don't be fooled by the lack of traffic in Hanoi. It's because school isn't in session at the moment because of the virus." Anyway, very, very interesting. You mentioned Vietnam's healthcare budget. Let's say an outbreak were to really take hold in the country. What challenges might Vietnam face at that point in dealing with a health emergency like that?
Yes, I think that was one of the worries that Vietnam had the cases been many and had been a big overflow of those cases, the medical system could be easily overwhelmed. That's why it was critical for the government to react early to limit the number. And I think there have been some centers that were not related to medical facilities that have been transformed temporarily for either quarantine or testing or temporary quarantine. So those are not strictly medical, but that were helpful and assisting the medical units to deal with the potential or suspected cases. So that's another way to mitigate those potentially overwhelmed medical centers. There was one time that there were quite a big outbreak in one of Vietnamese key hospitals, like mine, but luckily that was well dealt with, and then the cases were not serious enough to spread too big. But obviously it is a big limitation for many countries in the region, including Vietnam, that the GDP, the percentage of GDP investment in the medical public health is still limited, given how populous those countries are. So obviously Vietnam didn't have the advantages that, for example, Taiwan had, which Taiwan is one of the best in the world, medical services and healthcare insurance. I know because I lived there as well. Similar to Singapore, where I also lived, obviously Vietnam's budget is much more limited, but luckily there has been early recognition in that and how to ease that pressure from the medical centers.
So Vietnam, 100 million people, how supportive have their citizens been of the government's measures? Are they having, open up in lockdown protests, or how is that going?
I haven't heard of any protests. I think the experience of previous outbreaks, whether it's SARS or H1N1 and other communally transmitted diseases, have helped create that awareness that you have to be serious. It is for your own good or your own benefit, and you and your family and friends, rather than just what the government tell you. So it was taken seriously from the day one, and there was no protest. Obviously it wasn't easy for anyone, especially as Kylie would not remember, a lot of informal economy and street businesses and hawkers and street foods, those were all closed. So it wasn't easy to anyone, especially that the livelihood and economic livelihood was impacted. But I think as simple as wearing masks and obedience in that would be very helpful, because we've heard many times that in the absence of vaccine, mask is the best you can do, right? And then Vietnamese, it wasn't hard for the Vietnamese, because I think one is cultural thing. Another thing, a lot of countries, a lot of people in Asian countries wear masks anyway because of the air pollution. So it wasn't very hard transition. But I think that unity that the government very early on fostered through the approach of common enemy, and then through the recognition that we are in this together and we have to cooperate, and that's their civic duty, help. Because as the government propaganda said, staying at home is patriotism. It's the way to show that you love your country. So that also picked up as well.
Very interesting. Now, other countries in Southeast Asia haven't had Vietnam's success, right? But do you think there's lessons that these countries could take away from Vietnam about managing their outbreaks, even this far along?
Yes, it's difficult because we sort of passed already that golden opportunity, golden time window that I said, which is very early on to manage the crisis. But and also every country is very different. As you know, Southeast Asia, we tend to frame it as a sub-region, but it is very diverse and very different within Southeast Asia. For example, Vietnam wouldn't be comparable to Singapore in any ways in terms of social and organization. Or, for example, Singapore has an issue with foreign workers, which Vietnam doesn't necessarily have. Indonesia, for example, would probably be in a position to look at some responses, but obviously, as the different approaches, we are a lot in a new territory. We didn't know what this novel coronavirus is precisely, how it behaves. Does it do the lessons from SARS help or not? It could not, because to some actually it was misleading, because SARS stopped at certain, only affected East Asian, and some of Southeast Asian did it spread further. Indonesia was largely spared by SARS. So I think they might have thought the same this time around. I don't know, but that might explain why the response was a bit more hesitant. But in terms of lessons, I think first of all, everything must be adapted to the local conditions, whatever works within the country. But I think the key for me takeaway is early response and efficient communication to the citizens.
So I'll finish on with this question and on this kind of thought. This year, Vietnam's the chair of ASEAN. It's been almost 50 years now since Vietnam emerged from the Vietnam War, the war with the United States. As one of the poorest countries in Asia, now it's one of the fastest growing. And Vietnam's really starting to build a leadership profile, not just in Southeast Asia, but in Asia more broadly, right? How do you think this pandemic will help shape Vietnam's leadership position in the Indo-Pacific region?
So one of the key arguments in my article was that why was so successful, and I think this is one of the point that a lot of other analysts and other articles miss, which is Vietnam had been experiencing a tremendous external and internal pressure to deliver and to perform. So as you said, this year is ASEAN chairmanship. So there is a pressure to deliver. It is also constantly being coerced and harassed by China, so it cannot show any sign of weakness. It cannot afford to be weak or further weakened. And also internal pressure, which is Vietnam is gearing up to the 13th Party Congress. It is a once in a 5 years time where all the key leadership positions are appointed, as well as new policies for the next 5-year tenure, so until 2026. Very critical time. So both party, as a party regime and legitimacy, has had the pressure to perform. It cannot show signs of weakness. There cannot be any instability. It has to show strength. So both externally and internally, Vietnam had to perform, and it has performed. And I think it's a very good for the region to have a chair that is able to deal with the crisis rather than being absorbed by many crises at the same time. And even before the pandemic, Vietnam has shown quite a bit of leadership initiatives within ASEAN. Its position has changed gradually to a more, especially in regards to security issues and foreign policy issues. So I think its position has been slowly but consequently growing within the region, especially if we take into account that Indonesia, which has been the ASEAN's informal leader and kind of big brother among the ASEAN, had been more active, but in the previous 4 or 5 years had been less active. Vietnam has slowly taken the void and taking more initiative within this regional body. Now, in the Indo-Pacific, I think Vietnam also is gradually playing a stronger role, just because its strategic outlook, its reach out to major powers, and its improving relations with the major powers. I think everyone in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, recognized Vietnam's strategic potential, as well as strategic bandwidth to deal with security and broader regional issues. Not all countries in the region are in this position to display more of regional or global activism. And I think if this phase is the end of coronavirus, which it might not, but if it is, and Vietnam is emerging from it earlier than many other countries, as I said, first in Southeast Asia, and maybe that would mean that with less damage, with less economic damage, then it would be also in better position to continue on this strategic activism trajectory.
Well, it sounds like if this is a make or break moment for Vietnam, Vietnam's past.
Too soon to say.
This will make Vietnam. Well, thank you, Huong. We really appreciate your time. I recommend all of our viewers read your article. I think it has a very, very interesting, important message. Obviously, here at the Perth US Asia Center, we see Vietnam as an important country for Australia to build a partnership with. And we think that's an important message going forward. So thanks again. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity.